Welcome back to More Than a Statistic. Our next discussion is led by Haley Rigger. Haley is an advocate for social change in the anti-violence movement with a passion for creating safer communities through connection, mutual aid, and accessibility. Haley has worked with organizations in the space to provide education, resources, and technical assistance to service providers across the state to ensure comprehensive trauma-informed, culturally relevant services are available and accessible to all Hoosiers.
So often when we talk about sexual violence and sexual assault, we think about it in individual aspects. We think about what was she wearing? How much did he drink that night? Why did they go with that person? But sexual violence is a very pervasive problem in our culture, and so to really address it, we have to go beyond individual thinking and individual relationships and think about our comprehensive culture. As college students, you have the opportunity to really engage in culture change together, to create communities of care, to transform your campus culture, to move beyond just talking about individual behavior, and to move beyond instincts. So, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, 8 out of 10 rapes are actually committed by somebody known to the survivor. That means the vast majority of rapes are not occurring in the way that we normally talk about rape. We think about rape or assault as something happening by some creepy person jumping out at us from the bushes, right? But that's actually not very common. Survivors have probably already trusted their instincts. Maybe they were harmed by a partner, by a friend, a classmate, maybe even a family member. It's much less likely that this was someone that they didn't know. It's much less likely that they felt something was off and didn't follow their gut, right? They might have followed their gut already. They might have trusted their friend's friend, this acquaintance that they were just connected with. And so when we talk about that and we think about these individual behaviors and we think about these relationships that survivors may have had, we have to consider, is this an individual problem, or is this something that we can all work together to change? What are the prevention strategies that can support someone and prevent violence from happening within an intimate partner violence context, within a familial context, or among classmates and friends? So if we're moving beyond the individual, then we have to think about sexual violence within the context of our society. If you look at this pyramid here, this is kind of a culture of supremacy and sexual violence. At the very bottom, even beyond the bottom, kind of the soil, we see the isms of the world. Racism, sexism, transphobia, ableism, all of these things that position certain groups of people, because of aspects of their identity, as being above others or having more access to power and privilege, and marginalizing other groups. So once we have that concept of power, once we have that concept of control, and once we start to talk about our everyday relationships and concepts around sexuality, we can see how all of this kind of works together. So if that's our soil, our foundation is maybe how we talk to one another and how we normalize violence, power, and control within our society. Things like rigid gender roles, things like rigid sexual norms, where we're policing other people's sexuality, identifying what's too much, what's acceptable. Things like senses of entitlement and even stigma around speaking about sex or sexuality or violence. Once that's our foundation, we can start to move into things that kind of degrade other humans. So how we talk about locker room talk, harassment, slut shaming. What were you wearing? Why did you talk to him? Why did you go back in that room with her? Body shaming, when we start to think about how people's bodies look, too voluptuous, too skinny. Offensive jokes, where we're talking about someone's sexuality or body in a really funny way that demeans them. These are everyday parts of our culture. And we don't think of them as violent, but they create a normalization of violence. They create an environment in which folks start to kind of forget that the person they're speaking about or talking to is also human. Once we've degraded that, once we've forgotten about somebody's humanity, it's much easier to commit violence against them. That's why those isms are such a huge component of this. The less we think about someone else as a human being, it's much easier to start to normalize and accept violence against them. So when things like revenge porn, microaggressions, slurs, when those things happen, We might feel uncomfortable, but we've already normalized that. Moving up that pyramid, we start to see explicit physical violence occur. Groping, drugging, or coercion, all the way up to rape and assault. Those things are only possible because we've already established that basis. We've already established that foundation, a culture of violence in which we just don't care about other humans. So I'm not saying that there's no value in personal safety or self-defense. There definitely is. We should learn those skills. But we also have to think about how we can transform the cultures that we live in to create better access and better care for all of us. So knowing all of that, now that we've talked about moving beyond instincts, now that we've talked about moving beyond individual behavior, we can start to think about risk factors and preventative factors. So in the anti-violence movement, we use something called the socio-ecological model to examine violence at the individual, relationship, community, and societal levels. So if you look at the screen, you see these circles here. That smallest circle in the middle at the very bottom is the individual level, right? So that's where we talk about what risk factors make me as one person at a higher risk of violence than someone else. Well, if we've already established all of this context about our communities, about who has access to power and privilege, we know certain groups of people might actually be at higher risk of violence, partly because of who they are, but also because of those societal factors that deem who's acceptable, who's allowed to have power, and who we're allowed to commit violence against. Other individual factors might be substance use, but again, we have to think about the whole context, right? Another huge one is a personal history of violence. If I've already experienced violence, my threshold for what's acceptable might be a little higher or lower than someone else's. I may not see the red flags that somebody else might see if I've already experienced violence before. Maybe this interaction is less violent than what I've already experienced. At the relationship level, we see things like a family history of violence or a family history of mental health disorders. But where we can really start to see some of the bigger things is at the community level. Things like social isolation. Yes, we see social isolation in relationship, but we also see it in how our communities are created, even how they're laid out. Are there bus stops or sidewalks in my community so that I can get to the library, so that I can get to my knitting circle or whatever community activity it is I want to go to? Do I have access to people in my community that would believe me if I experienced violence? Do I have access to people that would support me if I came to them about an experience of violence? Additionally, at the community level, a risk factor is the weak community sanctions we see against violence. I'm not talking about just our laws. I'm also talking about how we all talk about violence and how we all engage with other people who have experienced violence or who have caused violence. Now, if I talk about community sanctions, you might think about the Brock Turner case or some of these other cases that we've seen in the media recently, where someone caused violence, they might have gone to trial, and then they were put on probation, or maybe not even found guilty at all. So while that's a really weak sanction and that's really frustrating, the way we speak about it with one another and the way that we show one another that we care or don't care about violence is what really speaks volumes. I'm sure many of us know, especially on college campuses, especially in our classes and at parties, we all know there's one person in that room or one person in our social groups that's kind of the creep, right? We've all known a creepy person in our lives. How did we talk about that person? How do we talk about people that engage with that person? If somebody's committing behavior that is unacceptable, have we had a conversation with them? Have we shown them that it's inappropriate? Have we shown them that it's not acceptable in our community? If not, then are we also kind of complicit? And then lastly, the societal level. So we're kind of going back to that pyramid that we just looked at. These are the isms of the world, the things that kind of create our structures, our institutions. How have we codified violence, power, and privilege into our laws? Our social and cultural norms really frame how we think about violence, how we address violence, and how we talk to one another. So if we know we have these risk factors at the individual, relationship, community, and societal level, that means there's also prevention strategies. So that means at the individual level, we can do things like skills building and education. We can talk about our consent and define our own boundaries, set boundaries for how people interact with us. At the relationship level, we can model appropriate relationships. We can teach one another about bystander intervention. We can talk about how to de-escalate a situation. We can intervene and support one another when we see violence or microaggressions occurring. But where we really start to see change is at the community and societal level. At the community level, we can engage in prevention by creating those community connections. We just talked about how isolation is a huge risk factor. So maybe I don't have sidewalks in my community. Maybe I don't have a bus route that goes by my house. How else can I engage in community? Can I engage virtually in community? Is there a church or a community center that I can walk to from my house? How can we support strong community sanctions against violence? We just talked about if we know somebody that's engaging in behavior that's unacceptable, are we having conversations with them? Are we offering them opportunities to change their behavior? Are we calling that out when we see it? And are we as a community saying we simply will not tolerate that type of behavior in this neighborhood, in this school, in this community? At the societal level, this is where really cool stuff happens. And this is where that transformation starts to happen. If we know our social and cultural norms promote violence, how can we change that? It starts with those other pieces. When we change how we engage with one another, when we change how we talk to one another, that's how we can transform that culture. That's how we can create cultures of community, cultures of care. We really want to see policies that promote rights and equity. Notice I said equity, not equality, because we're not there yet. We don't yet have equality, but we can advocate for equitable practices within our organizations, within our schools, and within our state and federal government. All I'm saying here is that rather than prioritizing teaching people not to get raped, we need to teach people not to rape. We need to teach people how to care for one another. We need to show that we care for one another. Meaningful primary prevention happens in relationship, in community. Through transforming social conditions that enable violence to happen, we really can address the root causes of violence and create spaces where we're all welcome, where it's accessible for everyone, and where each of us is safer.